Today we're looking at Syria again. Airstrikes on the Syrian city of Latakia earlier this month are now being attributed to the Israeli Air Force operating from a military base inside Turkey. No party has formally accepted responsibility for the strikes, and both Israel and Turkey have categorically denied that there was any cooperation to make such an attack. Nevertheless, speculation remains strong that some kind of joint military venture could have been undertaken.
Yet, the questions remain. Could Israel and Turkey really be engaged in cooperation on the Syrian issue, despite the loud row over Israel sinking one of Turkey's ships several years ago? And if so, what kind of cooperation would that be?
We're discussing these and other issues with our guest speakers, Nadim Shehadi, Associate Fellow at the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House in London, Tom Wheeler, former South African ambassador to Turkey and currently a research associate at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and Alison Bailey, Middle East analyst at Oxford Analytica, which is global affairs consultancy. So, Jan, I suppose you've done quite a lot of digging yourself when you were looking into the subject. Could you share some of the most interesting quotes with us?
I think the detail of this story came from the Russia Today, and the source who provided this information, which they've advised us, is someone very close to the situation. The detail.
Is it an unnamed source?
It's an unnamed source.
Oh.
It is a source purely who is close to the situation. But the detailed quote that has been provided was our sources telling us that Israeli planes left a military base inside Turkey and approached Latakia from the sea to make sure that they stayed out of Syrian airspace and that they cannot become a legitimate target for the Syrian Air Force. So that is an explanation of the tactics, why this move was used from Turkey. There was a certain strategic point to it. It was much easier to send the missiles, it is alleged, from this source than from a source within Israel. So these are some areas that has been very much sort of thought about, somewhat discussed. I think some of the other responses that are very interesting, we've said that the Turkish foreign minister, as you mentioned, denied this. This has actually been denied in the strongest terms. It said he who has called this all absolutely wrong, and he's called those who spread the rumours as an act of betrayal. So,
we couldn't expect any other comment from someone who is a member of the government in Turkey, because we still remember the difficult times in relations between Israel and Turkey. Though, and I still insist that we need to remember, and we need never forget that several years ago, Israel and Turkey were closest allies in the region. They're both American allies. Turkey is a NATO country. They have shared interests in the region. So I suggest we could listen to one of our guest speakers, Nadim Shehadi, and just to remind you, he is Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House in London, who is coming to us with more details of the incident.
Well, what I understood is that the attack near Latakia was the Israelis used a Turkish airspace rather than the Turkish airbase.
Which means that
they were allowed to fly over Turkey in order to hit the target in Syria.
Now, do you think that the Israelis could cooperate with Turkey on the Syrian issue?
Yes, certainly. They could collaborate definitely on intelligence. They could exchange intelligence. They could collaborate on military matters. The Israelis could help them politically with the Americans. And there is, of course, the NATO radar in Turkey, which is used to monitor Iran and can also monitor Syria. So there are ways they can collaborate, of course.
Which means that strategically they are still important allies, aren't they?
Strategically, they're both, allies of the United States, and strategically Turkey is part of NATO. So they're on the same side, but I don't think on Syria they have the same objectives. Turkey has come out very clearly for regime change in Syria, whereas Israel does not have such a clear official position. Israel's position is probably more for stability and security rather than regime change. They don't really have declared position for regime change.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Shehadi. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Nadim Shehadi, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House in London. Well, talking about who actually launched that strike, it looks like U.S. officials have confirmed that Israeli fighter jets on July the 5th bombarded a Syrian arsenal, which contained advanced, allegedly Russian-made Yahond anti-ship missiles, and that is according to Israeli newspaper Haaretz report. The information we're getting on this incident is really mixed. There are so many lies and there are so many distortions and there is such a strong lack of credible information on what's going on in the region now. For instance, when they were reporting that there were 50 Yahond missiles, which are anti-ship missiles, effectively. Anti-ship missiles. But each of those missiles is loaded with 250 kilograms of explosive. So if they are saying that the Israeli Air Force has targeted and eliminated a stock of 50 such missiles, no one has registered an explosion of this scope.
No, I mean, it's certainly surprising looking at those figures, doing the maths, and then trying to picture what kind of detonation that would create, and then to see what has actually taken place in Syria where the airstrikes took place. And certainly nothing of that scale has taken place.
Like that.
No, there is certainly no evidence to support that level of explosion by any means.
Which means that even seasoned experts, they too have their doubts about the information coming from that region. And now I suggest we might listen to Tom Wheeler, and this is a man of extensive experience in Middle East politics and diplomacy, since he used to be South African ambassador to Turkey, and currently he is a research associate at the South African Institute of International Affairs.
It's difficult to know because nobody is actually being very forthright on this. But, after the incident where the Israelis attacked the ship, the Mavi Marmara, that was on its way to break the blockade of Gaza, the relations between Israel and Turkey took a serious dive. Ambassadors were withdrawn and so forth. And there was, for the first time in many years, quite strong hostility between the two countries. Now, Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, in March of this year, apologized to Turkey for what had happened in an attempt to re-establish good relations, which used to be very important for Israel for military purposes, the supply of arms to Turkey, the use of Turkish airspace by the Israeli Air Force for exercising because their own airspace is so limited, and so forth. But it doesn't seem as if that has really gone very far, that the proposal that ambassadors should be exchanged again has not happened because the talks didn't work out. So I find it a little difficult to believe that the Israelis would have used a Turkish airbase to launch an attack on this weapons store on the coast of Syria. That would be my response to that.
Well, Ambassador, so do I get you right that you believe that this row between Israel and Turkey is more deep-rooted than it would seem?
Yeah, I think Mr. Erdogan is a difficult man, rather arrogant, should we say, and felt that his ship from Turkey had been attacked, and he's not prepared to forgive that. So ambivalent. The Turkish foreign minister, he has strongly denied that Turkish bases were used to launch this attack, and it's hardly necessary. I mean, Israel could very easily fly from Israel to this particular point without any difficulty. It wouldn't need to use a Turkish base to launch this attack. The attack being intended to prevent these missiles to attack ships, getting into the hands of Hezbollah, which is an organization that is aimed at undermining Israel and is largely sponsored by the Iranians. But they apparently have got the supply, or there's an allegation that these weapons were to be transferred to them, weapons that had originated in Russia. The whole story is very murky and very difficult to get to the truth, and why this information was leaked by American sources and so on. What's the point of this? Because both Israel and Turkey have tried to keep out of becoming involved in the Syrian effort, whatever their sentiments are about what's happening there.
I think that Turkey still hasn't managed to stay away.
there have been attacks across the border, and Turkey sits with something like 400,000 refugees from Syria and so on.
That's it.
But as the conflict in Syria is developing, it's turning into a sectarian fight between the Alawite ruling class, which come from Latakia, where the attack took place, and the Sunni majority. And in that, people like the Taliban, not Taliban, the Al-Qaeda people, are taking over, and on the opposition to Assad. So whoever replaces al-Assad might be worse than what is there now from the perspective of Turkey and Israel. So it's a very difficult thing to be clear on and whose interest is what and where the whole thing is going.
Sir, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Tom Wheeler, former South African ambassador to Turkey and currently a research associate at the South African Institute of International Affairs.
You're tuned to the Voice of Russia.
I don't think that a quarrel over the ship, which is important because people were killed then, but nevertheless, strategically, those are close allies, though, of course, quarrels could take place between them.
So clearly there are long-term strategic interests that would mean these things could be patched over, that there were common interests, that they would work together. And on the other side was very interesting to see the Israeli response, which was in some ways a little evasive.
Was it?
Yes. Benjamin Netanyahu, he in fact made a little joke. He said, every time something happens in the Middle East, Israel is accused. But
that's an old stuff, that's an old argument on the part of Israel, and I think is not devoid of a bit of pride.
It's certainly very much a sort of a strong response to that. And rather than directly say, in response to a question, was there a policy to cooperate with Turkey? Again, the question was somewhat finessed, and the reply that he gave the press in Israel was, I tell you what my policy is. My policy is to prevent the transfer of dangerous weapons to Hezbollah and other terrorist groups. So that is the policy.
But then the question comes, why wouldn't they target caravans coming from Turkey, which have been coming from Turkey for something like a year or so, with weapons to the opposition? Because as far as we understand, arming the opposition is way more dangerous than supplying weapons to regular forces. And besides, I still fail to see how those anti-ship missiles, how could they be a threat to Israel?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that seemed quite peculiar to me while looking through this.
So you noticed
who would be launching any sort of attacks from the sea? What kind of reason would there be to try to attack that? I suppose that
a sea attack on Syria could take place if the international community would decide to launch concerted military action on Syria. And in that case, Syria would need, of course, they would need the anti-ship missiles, but the question remains, what kind of threat would that be for Israel?
Yes, if yes, exactly. You'd think this is not something.
Makes no sense, really.
No, it's not a direct. It's not a direct threat, and it's quite a stretch to call it an indirect threat as well, rather than saying that it's to prevent a conflict spilling over into their borders, which is an argument we've heard before for this sort of similar situation. Certainly, the presence of missiles, I think they'd drawn a red line. It was something that they've previously referred to as a game changer or a conflict changer in the situation. This is just one of the things they've identified for some purpose. And they
no longer say that because there's been considerable data to show that the opposition was using the chemical weapons. If you remember, the red line was chemical weapons used by Assad's forces.
Yeah, but also they had previously. This is not to think about the chemical weapons. This is they had previously mentioned these anti-ship missiles in the same general conflict changing scenario. So this is the theoretical justification that has been put forward that we've seen read particularly in the Israeli sources from there.
So one thing is certain is that it is really a deadly turmoil taking place in Syria and spilling over to neighboring countries.
Yeah, and this was actually a comment that I saw that in the same report that was talking about the source who'd given this information.
Oh, really?
The commentary upon this was really saying that any involvement, particularly on the part of Turkey, really was playing with fire in this region for sort of stirring up the conflict, being able to draw into the conflict.
Well, Turkey is already drawn into a conflict, and there are other countries which are drawn into a conflict, well, the United States in particular. Now, I suggest we could still try to navigate the situation with the help of one of our guest speakers, and here is Alison Bailey, Middle East analyst at Global Affairs Consultancy, Oxford Analytica.
There are many doubts over this report. For Turkey, this would be a very risky maneuver to allow Israel to carry out an attack like that from its own base. I think what is more likely is that we see sort of Turkey and Israel actually cooperating more on less controversial areas, such as, for example, sharing intelligence.
But if we compare the stance of the two governments, the Israeli government and the current Turkish government, on the Syrian issue,
I think there's a very interesting comparison to be drawn there between Turkey and Israel and their respective stances on Syria. They have very many common strategic interests and concerns. For example, these two countries both have significant borders with Syria, which are now under threat as a result of increasing violence on the Syrian side of the border. These two countries are the leading military powers in the Middle East and have strong alliances with the United States and the West. So they have in many ways, similar concerns, and there is clearly a lot of scope for cooperation on Syria between the two of them because of their long-standing security alliance. However, there are a number of key differences, and they are firstly and most importantly to do with their aims. So Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he is very clearly focused on removing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from power. He has a very strong personal commitment to doing that and is really sort of putting all his resources into that aim. So he and Turkey are very strongly involved directly in the civil war through their support for Syrian rebels, some of whom are based on Turkish soil. Israel, by contrast, is really concerned about Hezbollah and the potential that this Shia Lebanese militant group, which is allied with Israel's enemy Iran, could be strengthened by the Syrian civil war. So particularly through the transfer of new and more advanced weapons from the Syrian regime to Hezbollah. So this explains why Israel has been carrying out a number of airstrikes on Syrian soil in the past year, with this most latest one on this port in Latakia just a few weeks ago.
But when we are talking, you said at the beginning of the interview that Israel and Turkey are cooperating in something like intelligence sharing, for instance. But do you think that there are prospects, and now I'm referring to midterm prospects, of Israel and Turkey getting back to their level of cooperation in the regional issues?
I think this is going to really take some time. We, of course, have had a very frosty period between Turkey and Israel since 2010 when Israeli forces fired on a flotilla on a Turkish ship and that was going to provide aid to people in Gaza. And the sort of diplomatic freezing of relations that we've had since that time has really improved a lot thanks to Israel's apology and agreement to pay compensation to Turkey earlier this year. But there are many complications and obstacles that remain in the way on this strategic relationship. I think essentially on the economy side, on trade, that is not going to be affected and that will continue to grow. The issue really is on military and security cooperation. So long as we have the AKP party, the Islamist party in power, and so long as Erdogan himself is in power with his strongly sort of anti-Israel personal sentiments, then really the prospects for a sort of strong and very public Turkey-Israel security alliance are actually very reduced.
Do I get it right that if the international community decides not to insist on Mr. Assad's removal, remember, there's been a bit of rumors that perhaps Bashar Assad would remain at his current position till the next election, which is scheduled for 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Do I get it right that Israeli government is not going to insist on his removal, whereas the current Turkish government might?
Well, this is exactly where there's a big divergence in opinion between Ankara and Israel. As I say, Erdogan is very personally committed to unseating Assad. He has been a lead proponent of bringing Assad down since the uprising started. Israel, on the other hand, is not so concerned about Assad. It doesn't mind, in a way, whether Assad stays or goes. Its main concern is that its border is secure and that there is no increased threat from Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant Shia group, as a result of the uprising. Israel is very keen to essentially stand back from the civil war and keep out of it, and it will only really intervene on a on a basis when it absolutely must. And this contrasts very strongly with Turkey, which is giving very strong and consistent support to the Syrian rebels in order to see Assad removed from power.
But what about other former Syrian allies, like Qatar, for instance? Would they support the move to keep Assad till 2014?
Again, the Gulf states are all very keen to see a rebel victory. And on this score, really, if we're looking at some kind of negotiated agreement around the next year's elections, I think that the prospects of any such agreement, which would need to involve local Syrian forces as well as these external forces that you mentioned, including Qatar and obviously Russia and the United States, the sort of prospects for an agreed international deal on Syria are really very slim in the medium term.
To me, it sounds like bad news, because it looks like Lebanon is catching fire, and this is very important.
There is a trouble, really, with all the countries surrounding Syria. They are all at risk of being increasingly dragged into the Syrian quagmire. And countries such as Lebanon that have a very weak national security force, but also a very fragile sectarian makeup, are particularly at risk. And we just saw the other week a very large bombing carried out in the Hezbollah area of Beirut, allegedly by a radical Islamist group with ties to the Taliban. And this is all really part of this emerging picture where we see radical Sunni groups being galvanized, being energized by the Syrian uprising and spilling over into other countries such as Lebanon, and then clashing with opposing forces there.
Ms. Bailey, thank you so much. And just to remind you, this time our guest speaker was Alison Bailey, Middle East analyst at Oxford Analytica. And now we end this edition of Burning Point